All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for our October Sheep and Goat monthly webinar. So I'm Kelly Froelich. I'm from South Dakota State University. And as part of our team, we have Melinda Ellison and Jalen Whaley speaking today. So Jalen's from South Dakota State University, and then Melinda's from Idaho State University. And also on our team that's not present today is Chad Page from Utah State University and Carmen Wilmore from Idaho. So with that, both Jalen and Melinda, they'll be talking about nutritional guidelines and estimating harvest weights for optimal quality when finishing lambs and kids. So up first is Jalen Whaley, and with that, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Kelly. So today, Melinda and I are going to kind of start things with the end in mind. So we're going to kind of work backwards from, looking at what your end goal should be for finishing some lambs or kids, and then work into the nutrition. So I'm going to get started again with the end in mind. So how do we evaluate quality? How do we know what those meat quality indicators are that we're looking for to produce in those meat animals? And some of that is guided by consumer preference. So I'll talk just really briefly on kind of what we're seeing from a consumer preference standpoint as well. And then the second half of my talk will be on actually estimating that ideal finish weight to create this high quality product, but then also making sure that we're finishing those lambs and kids economically to continue profitably creating a high quality product. So starting with on the sheep and lamb side of things, when we look at quality, we're really looking at our USDA yield and quality grades. If you're getting lambs processed in a small packer, chances are you're probably not getting these things back. But we'll talk a little bit about how you can still estimate these yield and quality grades if you're able to go in and look at your product. And so from a USDA commercial standpoint, our yield grades range from 1 to 5, with an industry average being about a 3. Our target should be a yield grade 2 to 3. But basically what this is trying to predict is how much yield or product to expect from that carcass. And it's based on the adjusted fat thickness, or more commonly known as our back fat, which is the fat thickness over the ribeye between the 12th and 13th rib. And I'll show you some pictures of that here in a second. But it can also be calculated. And so if you take that adjusted fat thickness, or that back fat thickness, and multiply it by 10 and add 0.4, you have your USDA yield grade. And so you can see in the table below, our USDA target for back fat thickness is 0.25, or 1/4 of an inch. And so that at a 0.25 will give you a calculated yield grade of 2.9, or a USDA yield grade of 2. And so if you were to go in and actually look at those animals that were processed, here's kind of what those carcasses would look like from a yield grade 1 to a yield grade 5. So you'll notice that our yield grade 1s are nearly devoid of any fat whatsoever, where our yield grade 5s are pretty excessive in fat. We are going to start to see some marbling as we move into those 3s, 4s, and 5s, but definitely at the expense of some excess external fat, I guess. There's a few other ways you can also estimate yield. So I mentioned the calculated yield grade. We can also look at dressing percentage, which is your hot carcass weight divided by your live weight. And we want a higher dressing percentage. And so typically for lambs and goats, it's about a 50% dressing percentage. So easy math, at least most of the time. Another measure that we can use on lambs, if you're able to go in and actually capture some carcass data, is the percentage of boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts. And this measurement actually will primarily only give you, or will only give you, an estimate of that red meat yield. It doesn't account for any of the bone in the cuts. but based on some research that's out there and some that I did in my master's work, that percentage of boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts is usually about 46% of the carcass weight. So if you've got an 80-pound carcass, you have about 40% in boneless, or a little less than 40% in boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts. So those are some options too in estimating yield. But on the lamb side, we can also look at our quality grades. And so when our USDA graders are looking and assigning a quality grade, they're looking at 3 different things. They're looking at maturity, or how old that carcass is. We know that lamb is classified either as lamb or mutton if the animal is above 12 to 18 months of age. And here in the US, we use ossification as our determining factor for maturity. And so when you look at those front leg joints on those animals, if they are less than 12 to 18 months of age and those bones haven't actually ossified or fused together, it'll still show up as this break joint that you'll see on the left. Once that animal matures, it will fuse together into a full spool joint. And a lot of some of the other countries around the world, they use dentition just like we would to age our sheep in general as an indicator of maturity of those animals. And so if those lambs have lost their very front milk teeth and their permanent incisors are starting to erupt or have fully erupted, those animals are then classified as mutton. Quality grade is also based on conformation or how heavily muscled that carcass is. In the past, we used to look at a leg muscling score, but anymore it's really a whole body muscle score. Quality grade also takes into account flank streaking, which can be an indicator of fat within the inside of the flanks, especially since lambs don't marble nearly like beef do. And so here's kind of a graphical depiction of what those quality grades look like. So we've got prime, choice, good, utility, and cull. But the truth of the matter is, on a commercial level, 94% of the lambs in the US are graded choice, and the other 6% are graded prime. And so from a quality grade perspective, we're really looking at quality as it pertains to a yield grade within those quality grades. Some research that I worked on when I was at the University of Wyoming was looking at carcass composition when lambs are too heavy. And so what we did was we looked at 2 different commercial packing plants in the Intermountain West. And what we found was, after surveying over 10,000 carcasses in those plants, during a time when the industry was backed up, we found that the average hot carcass weight on those carcasses was 89 pounds. So, rough math there, we're looking at 180-pound live animals going into those packing plants. And industry preference on carcass weight is about a 65 to 85-pound carcass for our commercial industry markets. At that time, over half of the lambs that were being processed exceeded that 85-pound upper preference. I also mentioned that our industry target for back fat is 0.25 inches. When lambs get backed up, we also see a pretty significant increase in back fat thickness. And so over 64% exceeded the industry target there. And so that's why it's really important that whether you're a commercial feeder or feeding lambs for yourself, it's really important that we're mitigating the weight of those lambs and the excess fat. And I'll talk a little bit later about the economic component of that as well. So for any of you goat producers unfortunately, USDA does not have any sort of grading system for goats. Part of that is because goats deposit very little external or subcutaneous fat, like your back fat. Most of their fat is going to be internal, like in your kidney, pelvic, heart regions, or down the side of the animal as well. And so when we look at goat quality, And you'll see this even if you look up goat markets and prices. We identify goat quality as either selection 1, 2, or 3. 1 being heavily muscled and selection 3 being poorly muscled. And so just to show you kind of some goat carcass quality images, if you get on the Maryland Small Ruminant page, they're a great resource for all small ruminant topics. But they did a really interesting carcass comparison study on goats. And so that kind of gives you a snapshot of what different goat carcasses might look like. To touch really briefly on consumer preferences, again, regardless of what market you're trying to sell into, we want to make sure that we're meeting our consumer preferences. And so several studies out there have shown that really what our consumers are looking for is just having an ideal eating experience. I think all of us in the sheep and goat world have had a poor eating experience and know how impactful that experience can be. And so how do we create a good eating experience for our consumers? Our consumers are also looking for quality, and for them, a lot of times that means something a lot leaner. That's where I think our smaller framed animals and our goats really have some opportunity, is that our consumers are looking for a leaner product. But regardless, the product needs to be consistent. And then lastly, I'll just touch really briefly on convenience. It's not so much an indicator of quality all the time, but we have seen a huge increase, especially since the pandemic, of people looking for easy, convenient ways to cook meals for their families. And so just some considerations there as you get stuff processed. So moving into estimating ideal harvest weight, it's not always as easy as, oh, well, just use a simple equation, or if you've got this breed, this is where they need to be harvested at. Partially because of the super diverse breed makeup that we have in the US. Plus, obviously, our climatic challenges and feed resources. Here in Western South Dakota, we have been extremely fortunate in that we've gotten plenty of rain this year, but I know there's other parts of the country that are not that fortunate. But our feed resources become an extreme challenge in making sure that we're getting those animals finished correctly. There's also, we talk a lot about the ethnic market with both our sheep and goat industries. And it used to be, the story was that our ethnic consumers want a small, lean product. But I think the more we dive into that ethnic market, we see that there's a little bit more diversity there than we knew. Either way, we're still looking for a high quality product going into the ethnic markets as well. If you are direct marketing, you'll probably have had challenges with getting those animals processed. So a lot of small packers struggle to even want to do sheep and goats. So that causes a challenge just getting stuff harvested. On the sheep side, we see just kind of the inherent seasonality of the sheep industry, where the majority of our lambs are being born in the spring. Plus, finally, the fact that our packers, producers, and consumers all tend to be in these very concentrated areas of the country, and not all of the time are they in very close proximity to each other. We look at the majority of our market lambs and goats being produced in the West, and that's where our large packers tend to be. However, we're shipping a lot of those lambs out east. And so that concentration creates some challenges in making sure that we're getting those animals harvested at the correct time as well. So then again, starting with sheep, there is an equation that was proposed by Dr. Jeff Held from SDSU in 1999. And what this equation does is it takes the average weight of your sire and dam, and then you should be able to reach about a yield grade 2 when their offspring has reached 65% of their mature weight. And so what you would do is take your ram mature weight and your ewe mature weight and average those and then multiply by 65%. So for example, here, let's say you've got 180-pound ram and 130-pound ewe. The average of those would be 155, and then 65% of their mature weight to produce a yield grade 2 carcass, you should be harvesting their offspring at approximately 101 pounds. Just for, I guess, simplicity's sake, Thomas out of the University of Wisconsin, if you don't want to do the math, did create this really nice chart to show that exact same equation simplified. And so feel free to take a picture of this chart or to do the math on your own flock. But the shaded area there that you'll see is kind of indicates that desired live weight in most commercial markets. And then also gives you some really nice estimates of mature weights for some of our more common US breeds. The other thing to consider on both sheep and goats is that there are things like frame size that impact your finish weights. These studies referenced are all sheep studies, but the same thing applies for goats. And so what these studies found was that regardless of frame size, all of those breeds are going to deposit fat at the same rate. And so in that case, our smaller frame sizes are going to have less surface area to deposit that fat and will put on subcutaneous fat more quickly. Your dressing percentage is also going to increase as your frame size increases. And then as you increase your live weight, you're also going to increase both your quality and your yield grade. And these studies have also shown that increased live weight also results in increased fat deposition. If you are producing a later maturing breed, a lot of times these are your larger framed, more maternal type breeds. They are probably going to produce a much larger, leaner carcass than your smaller frame breeds. On the goat side, unfortunately, there hasn't been any research where the average live weight of federally inspected goats are being harvested at. And so as you can see here, for the most part in 2023, most of those animals have been harvested between 63 and 66 pounds. Another indicator that we can use if you're finishing lambs and kids is to use a measure that we should be using hopefully in our flocks already, and that's body condition score. And so if you're unfamiliar with body condition scoring, what we're looking for is we're actually going to palpate behind the last rib to try and get an estimate of fat cover. And so these pictures come from the sheep production handbook. But what you can see is as you increase in body condition score, you're increasing in fat thickness over what would be that ribeye. As I mentioned on the goat side, they're not going to deposit that fat over the ribeye like a sheep will. So you can also body condition score goats within the brisket over the sternum. And so in your body condition score 1, you'll be able to easily feel and move that sternum. As you increase body condition score 3, again, just like our sheep, wanting those lambs and kids to be finished at a body condition score 2 to 3, you'll be able to feel some fat deposition there, but you can still feel the sternum. As you get up into a body condition score 4 and 5, it becomes pretty difficult to feel the sternum through the tissue that surrounds it. And the reason why estimating or knowing where our lamb should be finishing is extremely important because we want to make sure that we're doing it economically. And this might be something that you have to play with. Maybe those calculations or maybe that body condition score isn't necessarily exactly where you're realizing that those animals are maximizing your cost per pound of gain. Because as an animal reaches its maturity, its bone and muscle growth is going to begin to level out, as does its average daily gain. Meanwhile, your fat content, as we all know, you can definitely increase your fat content on ewes and rams beyond their mature weight. But as we start to see that average daily gain level out, that's when we start to lose the cost effectiveness of feeding them. And so that's where we can calculate cost per pound of gain. And there's several different ways of calculating this. The simplest, I think, is just to take your daily feed cost divided by your daily weight gain. And so this is an extremely rudimentary example. But let's say you've weaned a 70-pound lamb. You want that lamb to be gaining about 2/3 of a pound a day. And so that's going to require approximately 3 pounds of feed per day. Again, a very basic ration. Let's say you're feeding 25% alfalfa, 75% corn. And based on current prices, that's about 13 cents per pound on alfalfa and 8 cents per pound on corn, bringing your daily feed cost to 37 cents a day. So then if we take that 37 cents divided by your average daily gain of 2/3 of a pound, you're looking at about 56 cents per pound of gain on that animal. If we move up to a 130-pound lamb, that's starting to decrease in average daily gain. So he's gaining approximately 5 pounds a day, or half a pound per day, being fed about 5 pounds a day. Our cost per pound of gain there is then 92 cents per pound of gain. And so you can see that as our average daily gain goes down, it becomes significantly more expensive to feed those animals. If you're direct marketing, the other option is at what weight do you make the greatest return? Obviously, our consumers want a leaner product, but sometimes if we underfeed those animals, you're also inhibiting the amount of product that you're actually putting into a package and selling to your consumer. And so determining your break even and at what is the optimal weight for you to sell that you're going to make the greatest return. And when just starting out with direct marketing, usually price is the biggest question that people ask me. And I always usually will send you first to the National Monthly Grass-Fed Lamb and Goat Report. This is our only report that we really have that provides any sort of direct-to-consumer marketing pricing. And so that's where you can start your basis on break-even and calculating the amount of profit you could make based on different levels of finished weights. But I always put in here too that keep in mind, as you look at this month's direct marketing reports, in some cases we've got cuts selling as high as $24 a pound. So keep in mind that lamb and goat is a premier protein, and we want to make sure that we're still making money and providing high quality lamb and goat to our consumers.
So Melinda's talk is on nutritional guidelines for finishing lambs and kids. So I will let her, kind of take it over and go over her talk.
Thank you so much. I am really excited to come off the tail end of Jalen's talk because she set me up really well for some of the things that I'm going to talk about. Definitely that timing as far as how long to feed and what end result that you're looking for is really important, even, from the perspective of the consumer and the quality of the product, but also from a feeding standpoint and making sure that what we're doing is both working for the finishing of the animals as well as your budget, right? So let me slide through. So first and foremost, when you're thinking about finishing lambs and kids, and as I go through, obviously my background is more in sheep, and I've tried to balance both lambs and kids in this talk. And most of it is going to apply across the board. So just so you're aware, there's some subtle differences with goats, obviously, compared with lambs, but for the most part, we can apply some of the same sort of guidelines to finishing both types of animal. And so first and foremost, you want to consider what types of housing and feed options that you have within your operation when you're thinking about how to finish lambs and kids and what the best way to go about that is. And so, of course, whether you're in a situation where you have lots and lots of pasture and you want to finish them on grass, maybe you have a confinement or a dry lot scenario where you can feed them at a faster rate, but having those housing options are definitely going to play a role in how you feed and what you feed to your animals, as well as the feed options that are available to you, whether those are home-raised options, hay, pasture, that type of thing. If you're living in an area where you have easy access to different types of grains and crops and those types of things, so it's very dependent on those as well. And so as we go through here, just note that in your situation, it may be quite different than somebody across the country, for example. Obviously, labor can play a really big role in feeding and finishing growing lambs and kids. Certainly also dependent on how much time you have, what sort of equipment you have available. All of those things are really going to play a role in how you can feed your animals. And when you're wanting to feed animals at a faster rate, you clearly have to feed them more often versus maybe having a pasture scenario where you're going to grass finish these animals, but it's going to take longer in the long run to get them to the point that you're trying to achieve. Also dependent on the age and stage of animals, and by that I mean, when were the animals born and at what stage are they in? Were they early weaned and we're trying to push them to finish early? Are they weaned at 120 days and we're trying to finish them within the next couple of months? Very different when it comes to the feeding plan. If you early wean and don't want to finish for 6 months, different levels at which you would be feeding those animals. And obviously, no matter what stage or type of animal you're feeding, when you're putting those last pounds on, you really need to have really high quality feeds that you're providing to them. And it's a definite decision to be made based on availability, but also how fast do you want those animals to grow and reach that final endpoint, and also the cost that's going to be associated with those, which we'll go into. Also, I'll hit on this many times, but the most important ingredient to growing animals is water. They need to have clean access to ad libitum water all day, every day. They also should have a good salt and mineral supplementation plan, which we'll get into in more detail. Parasite control is obviously an important one. You don't want to have a group of wormy animals trying to finish them out, because they just are not going to have the same growth potential that they would if you were having control over those things. And then obviously, especially if you're going into a confinement situation, herd health is really important. And if you have animals that are becoming ill to whatever they may be coming down with, respiratory or gut bacteria, whatever it may be, we have to have a plan in place to be able to pull those animals out, make sure that we provide them with the health care that they need, and then also not contaminating back into the rest of the flock those problems that you may have. And so we aren't going to spend a lot of time in biosecurity, but it's important to remember that most diseases and things that afflict sheep and goats can also be carried and caught by humans, so they're zoonotic. And so remembering that bringing those things to them, or you contaminating across pens, all of those things can happen just by walking through and having contaminated boots, or pulling an animal out that's sick, but then sharing feeders or whatever it may be, shared water, all those things. It's really important to have that clean environment and be handling those sick animals as they come along appropriately so that you're not having that contamination spread. And a lot of times you'll have subclinical animals too, which can cause decrease in growth and performance, but may not be readily seen to our eyeball to be able to handle. So Jalen talked a little bit about this already, but from a feeding standpoint, let's say that we're estimating how long we're going to be feeding these animals to get them to the point that we want to get them to. And of course, we talked about different sized animals and breeds of animal and what their growth potential may be. I'm basing this slide off of an animal that is maybe a sheep that is one of the breeds that is built for making meat and has that high growth potential. So maybe we're finishing lambs at around 150 pounds. This is definitely on the higher end of what you'll see with some of the smaller and medium-sized breeds. But let's just, for the sake of argument, say we're targeting that 140 to 160 pound range. And if we're thinking about these animals, certainly there's going to be times where your animals are not consistent across the board as far as their current weight and status. If you have a lambing or kidding season that's 6 to 8 weeks long, certainly a 20-pound difference between animals is not completely unheard of. And so my best recommendation when it comes to this is to break these animals into groups of similar sized animals, because then you're going to be able to target feed them in a way that's more appropriate for where they are and where they end up. And so if you have lambs these are probably younger, maybe they have some kind of a reason that they're being, slower growing animals, whether it's parasitism or whatever, poor, no colostrum consumption at birth, and those types of things can play a role in the way that these animals grow. So you've got this batch of 80 to 100 pound lambs, and you're probably going to have to feed them a little bit longer to get them where you want to go. And so this is somewhat of another math problem that you have to think about, in addition to the ones that Jalen talked about as far as what is the growth potential of your animals and how to calculate those things, which she did a great job covering, so I'm not going to go back over. But if you wanted to have these animals gain a total of 60 pounds, and you are going to try to achieve a half a pound gain per day, and you've got to do it over a 16-week period. And so the simplicity of this math is to say, how many pounds of gain per day do I need to hit in this period of time to get to the goal that I'm looking for? So if you break these animals into 3 separate feeding groups, you can adjust their feed and honestly, the types of feed, the quality of feed, all of those things can play a role. You certainly don't need to put the last 4 weeks finishing ration on a lamb that needs to gain 60 pounds, because you're going to have animals that are reaching those finishing indicators sooner than they would if they were allowed to grow at a pace that is more natural for them. And one of the things that Jalen mentioned also was that you really want to be looking for those quality indicators. And once you reach a certain amount of finish, whether that's back fat or whatever it may be, any feed that you're giving them beyond that point just to create size in those animals, it's a poor investment, because you're just building fat onto those animals. So certainly having a good idea of the breed, the growth potential that those animals have, and trying to target that is important when you're talking about your budget and how the cost of gain is going to land for you. These are just sort of estimates of growth potential when it comes to lambs and meat goats. You usually see lambs growing in the range, when they're on some kind of a grower or a finishing ration, a range of 0.45 to 0.75. The 0.75, 0.8 pounds a day, that's a pretty high growth rate, and you're not going to see that in breeds that are not developed for meat production. They just don't have that kind of growth potential a lot of times. And certainly some breeds we're going to fall even lower than this growth potential, maybe a dairy breed or something like that. They just don't have the growth potential that those other lambs do. I'm like I said, I'm not a goat person, but these are the growth rates that I was able to pull up when I was doing some research in this area. Certainly some goats may have more growth potential than 0.25 to 5 pounds a day, but it's something to keep in mind is if you have animals that have the slower growth potential, you're going to have to keep them on feed a little bit longer, and you're going to have to adjust in that way, because you're never going to get a wool breed to grow the same as a Suffolk, for example. So I've mentioned this a couple of different times, but the growth rate of animals is dependent on so many things. And just to start, gender, male lambs and kids are going to grow better, especially if they're not castrated. That's just the nature of the beast. The breed plays a huge role, and along with their genetics, what is their actual growth potential? What's their mature body size? How are they going to get there? Do they get there more slowly? All of those things are just bred into them, and that's just all there is to it. Their environment plays a huge role along with their health status. So if we're talking about extreme climate changes like we see in the fall, maybe cold nights, warm days, or we have parasitism, or we've got a bout of something going through the flock, all of those things can influence their growth potential. And primarily what influences growth potential, if it's there, is their nutritional status and how hard we're pushing them to get to that market finish. And so these are all things to keep in mind as we're deciding how hard to push these animals and how long we're going to be able to keep them until market. So when we talk about selecting feed type, like I said, it's important to just analyze what is available to you and what's going to cost you the least amount of money to get your desired outcome. Grass-fed animals is something that's become very popular. There's a lot of people that like to have their animals finished on grass, and it's definitely more difficult to finish animals on these forages than it would be to pull them in and put them on a higher concentrate diet, but it's still possible if you have the right makeup of pasture. And so to be able to really push these lambs to finish, or these goat kids to finish, you really have to pay attention to what types of pasture you have and where the pasture is in maturity stage. So obviously you want to have pasture that has good nutrient content to support the growth of those animals. You want it to be digestible and palatable. So we're talking about those really early stages of grass growth where it's really green and lush and it's tastes good and it has, you know, that higher protein and higher energy content in it. So early growth on a pasture or a good pasture with regrowth, those are going to give you that ideal protein and energy supplementation that's going to drive them to finish. But you also have to remember that those types of forages at that stage are also going to be really high in water content. And so it's going to cause some issues as far as what the animals are able to intake. Plus, you may have to have some roughage, some hay or whatever incorporated into their diet so that they have a better chance of digesting and utilizing those forages as they need to. Also, being out in the pasture, especially if grazing management is not done properly, overgrazing especially can cause higher levels of parasitism, but frankly, just wet fields, those types of things, they're gonna come with a higher risk of those types of issues. Also making sure that they have the proper mineral package for the type of feed that they're on is really important. And they're also going to just gain slower. And so the better feed quality, the faster the gain, but you're not going to be able to pull a 0.8 pounds per day growth out of these animals in most cases, unless you have something mixed in there that's a little bit higher quality than just grass. So when we talk about confined finishing, this is one of two things that can happen, right? So we have maybe lambs that we have had on grass all summer long, and we've now weaned and pulled them into confinement to do that last 30 to 60 days of finish. It could also be an early wean scenario where they have been in confined feeding for a period of time at a slower growth rate to try to achieve a good finish on them. Either way, confined feeding is a great way to push those animals to their full growth potential, but it is going to cost more money because we're providing them with higher quality feeds, and we're pushing it on them in a lot higher quantity than we would maybe if they're out grazing. So there's a couple of ways that you can do confined feeding. One would be bunk feeding, where you're providing them with feed 2-3 times a day, depending on what types of labor, feed, and equipment that you have available to you. This would be a scenario where having a feed truck that can mix a ration for you and then spit it out the side along the feed bunk for the animals a couple times a day, 2-3 times a day. But certainly you can do it by hand as well. This way of feeding, you can provide all kinds of different feeds. If you're in an area that you have some really unique options, this is a great way to mix a ration that can be fed to the animals. And you can include things like a mineral package, molasses, other byproducts that might provide you some different types of nutrient values and that type of thing. It's a lot higher labor than any of the other options, and the cost is going to be variable whether you get good rates on some of your feed or not. The other option with confined feeding, of course, is a self-feeding type scenario, and you're giving those animals constant feed. So if you're talking about a self-feeder for grains, this can be a little bit limiting because you have to have a certain type of feed to provide in those. Maybe it's a all the time free hay choice, whatever it may be there. This is usually a lot lower labor, but it can cost more because you have to put those specific types of things through that feeder. And certainly you can do a combination of the two. Maybe they're having free choice access to hay, but then you feed them some kind of a grain mix 2 or 3 times a day in addition. So we won't go through this in a lot of detail necessarily, but here are some of the pros and cons when it comes to finishing on confined high concentrate diet versus a pasture or forage diet. Obviously, we get animals to grow faster. We have some tendency for people to prefer the milder flavor of the concentrate fed animals. Usually we don't have as much of an issue with parasites when we're talking about a confined feeding situation. And when we look at the cons of that, we definitely can come across more digestive disturbances and things like that. We'll talk about towards the end of this, as well as the cost and those types of things that are required in order to do that. Of course, pasture settings, we have, that situation where people may want those grass-finished animals. They may prefer the flavor, they may prefer the health benefits that come from that. But certainly we're going to have some issues potentially with parasitism and predation and that type of thing that we have to deal with. And we also just have to have a much larger area and the pasture to support that. So when we talk about selecting our feed type, there's a few things to keep in mind when it comes to the roughages, especially. When we talk about feeding an animal a coarse forage, it's going to slow down their digestion rate because they have a lot more bulk to break down and be able to utilize. It is, of course, going to be the least amount of labor when it comes to feeding forages. And it's going to probably cost you the least because it's the least amount of handling that occurs with these types of feeds. Unfortunately, it just takes them longer to digest, and it's going to slow down their ability to convert feed into pounds of gain. One way to overcome that is to do a chopped or a ground forage if that's a possibility. It does increase the digestibility of that forage without having a ton of extra cost. A lot of times, depending on the equipment you have available to you, but it does take a little more labor. However, chopping the forages can decrease the amount of waste that the animals are going through as well. Obviously, the coarse forages, you see a lot of waste, especially when you're giving them free access choice to those types of feeds. Pelleted is going to be the best way to feed roughages because in this scenario, just because of the digestibility. They're going to have a much higher rate of conversion from feed to pounds of gain, but it's definitely going to cost a lot more money, and it's going to change the way that you are able to feed. You know, you have to go to a more of a bunk or a feeder system rather than just out on the ground somewhere. Roughages are really important in the diet, and when we talk about lambs or kids on a finishing diet, we need to have at least some roughage in the diet. And by that is the importance of it for a number of reasons, but one is to really just stimulate the environment inside the rumen and keep those feeds moving through and having that motility through the digestive tract. These animals are the most roughages are the most important pieces of a ruminant diet, so you can't just eliminate them altogether. It's also going to encourage their cud chewing, which is an important factor when it comes to digestion and all of those things that happen within the ruminant digestive tract. And you also have risk of acidosis, which we'll talk about in a little bit when it comes to those high energy concentrate type diets. So by providing some amount of roughage into the diet, you are decreasing your risk of that happening in the animals while they're on that high concentrate diet. So one of the things that we have to mention, of course, is when we're talking about roughages, there's a lot of waste that occurs with these animals. So you can, like I said, chop or pellet the forage. You can put the forages, if you're free choice feeding, into some kind of a panel or a hay rack system. And the best way to avoid injury or death when it comes to these systems is to prevent them from being able to climb or be on top of the hay, because it can collapse bales, and we've probably all been subject to suffocated animals because of a hay collapse, which is a really unfortunate way to lose one. So just putting up those higher panels where they don't have as big of a opportunity to be climbing and jumping is important. So these are all things that could be supplemented into the diet that you may or may not have access to, but this is just a great way to sort of consider some of the options that you have. Soybeans are a really great source of protein along with cottonseed. There's a million ways you can get those, whether it's whole or meal or any of the options that you can get those to. In alfalfa hay, you can put urea into the diet, and there's a ton of byproducts that also provide a lot of good protein. You can put brewer's grains or distiller's grains, corn gluten meal, those types of things. The ones that provide energy, obviously corn, barley, oats, wheat, milo, beans, peas, rye, millet. These are all things you can add. You can put some brands or meals in there that help provide the energy. Oils are a great addition if you need extra energy without a ton of extra cost. And you can also provide the beet pulp, orange pulp, potato pulp, whatever kind of pulp is available to you. And then molasses is one that you can use for increasing the energy content, and also mixing the ration if you're going to do a total mixed ration. And it helps things kind of stay where they're supposed to. When we're talking about concentrates, certainly corn is going to provide the best relative feed value of all the grains. So we're going to say that's 100%. You can see along this list that there are, based on corn, where our relative feed value lies with these other types of grains. And there's some caveats, of course, with some of these that we have to consider. Like wheat, for example, you really don't want to have more than 50% of the diet be made up of wheat. And obviously, you know, molasses, you can't give them a diet of pure molasses. So there's some considerations there, but this gives you an idea when you're choosing a feed, what the cost effectiveness is going to be. So when we think about what the animal actually needs to be able to grow, this chart is probably fairly overwhelming. It goes anywhere from early weaned lambs, and we're trying to grow them quickly and get them out the door, or early weaned with moderate growth, or maybe we're just talking about that last phase of finishing lambs. We're going to focus on this top one just because of the time of year we're at. but these could apply across the board as you look down what you need to do. So dry matter intake is the amount of feed that an animal should be targeted to consume in a day. And we have to consider that some of our feeds are made up of a portion of water. So for example, most hays are going to fall in the approximate 90% dry matter range, meaning that they're 90% dry matter and 10% water. Water obviously doesn't provide nutrients to the animals the way that these other feeds would, although water is very important to include in the diet, but we don't include that when we talk about feed value. So this is a conversion that you would have to make from dry matter to the as fed portion of the diet. So we'll talk about that in a second, how you can calculate that. TDN is one that I will point out as being important because it's the energy component of the feed. And so when we talk about energy, we want to have 72 or 77% of that diet being made up of the energy component. This is pounds per day that they need to have of that energy. Protein is the other one that we have to consider on the macro level. Protein for these animals, the smaller the animal, the higher the protein required. And it's because they just don't consume quite as much feed, right? And then we have 10 or 11% on these older, sorry about that, on these older lambs. So again, these are somewhat consistent across lambs and goats. And it's the idea is to make sure that they're getting what they need of each of these types of energy protein. Calcium and phosphorus are really important as far as making sure that these animals are not subject to having gut upset and that type of thing. And it's important to have your calcium and phosphorus at the right level, but it's also important to have the ratio correct. So at least 2 to 1 or a little higher of calcium to phosphorus is required to make sure that these animals are getting what they need. So if we are thinking about how much do I actually feed to these animals, and we have to understand that when we're feeding forages especially, fill is a limiting factor. And that means when they get full, they'll stop eating and they may not be receiving what they need out of that feed because they're only willing to eat so much. So that's why these values here are important to consider in addition to the nutrient requirements of the animal. So let's consider an alfalfa hay. Let's say it's a 90% dry matter. So you remember 90% dry matter and 10% water. Let's say that this feed is 19% protein and 55% TDN, which was the energy component of the feed. So let's just say we're feeding these animals 3.5 pounds per head per day. And that's on a dry matter basis. So how much is that on a regular as fed basis? If we know that it's a 90% feed, dry matter, then we can take that 3.5 and divide it by 0.9, which is 90%, and 3.9 pounds per head per day is how much you're physically going to feed of that hay to the animal. To calculate protein, if we are feeding 3.5 pounds of dry matter per day, and we multiply 19%, 0.19, we know that we're feeding 0.67 pounds of protein per head per day. And if we look up here, 0.67, for some of these guys is almost double what they need, right? So we're definitely meeting our protein requirement. In fact, we are overfeeding protein, and that can be considered an excess cost, if you will. If we're talking about our TDN, which is the energy component, we can take 3.5 pounds per day that we're feeding of dry matter multiplied by 55% or 0.55. Then we get 1.93 pounds of TDN per day. Now you can see that we're coming up short, although not by a ton, but we're coming up short on their energy requirements when we're feeding these animals. So as you can see, if they're only willing to eat 3.9 pounds of hay per day, they are not going to be getting the energy that they need. So how much would they have to eat to meet their energy or their protein their energy requirements of 2.7? So we can do 2.7 divided by 0.55, and that tells us that we would have to feed almost 5 pounds per head per day to meet that energy requirement by just feeding alfalfa. You can see now if they're only willing to consume 3.5 and we have to feed them almost 5, you can see where the problem is going to come. So we're going to be shorting these animals on their energy, which is why we can't just feed alfalfa if we want to give them the right finishing ration to get them to that end spot that they're going to be at. This is going to restrict their growth by quite a little bit because energy and protein are critical to be balanced if you want to have an animal growing at its potential. So again, fill is a limiting factor. Other things that can affect how much an animal is eating, the type of feed, of course. If you are feeding roughages, they fill them up quicker compared with maybe a pellet, something like that. So they're going to eat a little bit more of that pellet than they would the roughages, just because it doesn't fill them up as much. You also need to make sure that the vitamins and minerals are balanced. This is really critical, and it's something that doesn't get done nearly often enough, is making sure that they have what they need for vitamins and minerals. And I'm going to tell you how to do that specifically in a minute, but they're so critical, especially in growing animals or pregnant animals, especially because a lot of the minerals and vitamins are just critical for that growth that the animal needs to have. So it's certainly a good idea to get an idea of what's in the feed you're giving them and make sure that this is balanced. And a lot of times you're going to have to provide them some kind of a mineral supplementation. Also, the temperature and the swing in temperature every day, the climate that they're in, the breed of the animal, of course, affects how much they're eating and the history that they may have. So, I indicated earlier, an animal that didn't get the colostrum at birth, they may just not have, what they need to be able to consume the right amount of feed that gets them to the finish line. A couple of things you can do to increase feed consumption and help with some of the issues that may arise in a confined feeding scenario. You could provide the animals with ionophores. This is usually done to prevent or manage coccidiosis, but it also can increase the rate of gain in these animals as well as increase their intake. Probiotics are something that you can also add to the diet that improve the digestion of things and help with various health aspects, all of those things. So those are things that you could include. Sometimes they're cost prohibitive. So as far as really understanding what you have as far as the feed goes, it's really important, if you want to get it right, to get your feeds analyzed. And so this is just an example of a feed analysis that I did on my own personal alfalfa this year. So it gives you all of the values that you need. You've got your protein, you've got your TDN, which is your energy. All of those things are available to you, as well as all of the minerals that you have in that feed. And this is just one of the labs that you can send it to. We've had Rebecca Kern on our webinar before, which is why I chose this one, but certainly all of the feed analysis laboratories can assist with getting this done for you. And then you can get a much more accurate view of what you're feeding and if it's going to be effective and balance it in the proper way. So a couple of things to consider. You want to test each of the types or batches of feed that you have. Sometimes if you buy a bag of grain or a tote of grain or whatever from a feed store, it will come with some kind of a guaranteed analysis that you can input into your calculations. If you are testing your hay, make sure that you're testing you need to get a hay core tester or borrow one from your extension office, or NRCS office may have something like that. But make sure you're getting core samples out of about 20% of your hay from each batch. So if you have one field of alfalfa, you want to test 20% of those bales, and it can all go in one, baggie. Send it off. They will do the analysis for you, and it'll come back with this. And it's usually not super expensive, $12, $15, maybe $20 per sample, but it's well worth it, because if we're talking about $15 sample that we can put 20 more pounds of gain on our animals, it's going to be worth it in the end to do that analysis. So when it comes to developing rations, I can't come on here and give you a catch-all, here's what you should feed your animals idea. I can give you some ideas of what you should do and base it off of what kind of growth rate you want, what type of animal you have, what situation that you're specifically in, and that's all of those things play a role. And if you want to do a really good job, my recommendation would be to work with a nutritionist. I do it for people quite a bit. Feel free to email me your situation. I can help you. And this goes for not just feeding lambs, but feeding pregnant ewes and lactating ewes and all of the things that you might need to do. It's really a good idea to put them through some kind of a ration balancing program, because it gives you an idea of all the macros and vitamins and minerals and how well they're balanced. So you can get a really good feel for what your nutritional status is in those animals. But you want to provide at least 10% of the diet in roughage. So that provides the animals with all the things I mentioned before that allows them to have a better digestion, better system altogether. And it helps them decrease the chances of digestive upset when it comes to these higher concentrate diets, especially. You want to capitalize on the feeds that are available to you, and that could mean that they are cheaper. It could mean they're closer. It could mean that they're super unique to your situation. But you want to make sure if you're doing that, you balance it out and make sure that the mix that you're putting into your animals is the proper mix for whatever stage that they're in. So like I said, work with a nutritionist, one of your extension specialists. There's lots of people out there that do consulting on nutrition. Certainly working with those individuals, whether you're paying somebody or capitalizing on some of your extension specialists, whatever. And if you are planning to do this type of balancing regularly, it's worth learning how to run the ration balancing software, which is also something that a nutritionist can work with you on. It's super easy to do once you get the premises down of what needs to go into it. These two diets here are an example of something that you could feed your animals. One of the things to consider here is that we're not just giving these animals 90% of their ration in corn, right? Yes, they can have quite a little bit of corn, 75% of their diet, perhaps. But you also need to be able to make sure that corn, which is around 9% protein, is just not going to be enough to provide the protein that those animals need. And so you're going to end up being short on protein in that case. So you want to mix in something else that has the protein that they need, like cottonseed, alfalfa, soybean, all those things can be used. And maybe you do a different type of corn and mix in something different. It's really important to have these balanced correctly so that they're just getting what they need, and include some kind of a mineral mix based on where your animal's status are for minerals and vitamins. And so these are all things that can be done on this ration balancing software. Here are a handful of options when it comes to the ration balancing softwares that are available. Unfortunately, goats are a lot less serviced as far as these ration balancer systems, but there are a few out there. One that's free, that's pretty easy to use, is the Montana State University sheep ration program. I've used that quite a bit. I also prefer the Sheep Bites just because of all the work that I do with balancing rations. It's a great program, but you do have to pay for that. So there's a handful of options here that you can look into. Certainly several free ones that would do the job for you in enough of a way that you would know that you're doing what you need to do. The main thing here is that just got to use some common sense as far as what you're inputting into the system, because it doesn't tell you sheep are not going to eat 3 pounds of vegetable oil and do well, right? So you have to have that built into your brain as you're working through these rations. But certainly, like I said, happy to help if I can. One thing I will mention though is if you are going to come to me with help with balancing a ration, I do have a stipulation that I like to have some idea of what is in each of your feeds. And so sending off for those feed analyses is really important to do a good job. And Jalen mentioned this, and so I won't go into it exhaustively, but the break-even point can be really important. So if you have animals that are 20 pounds from finish and you're gonna dump all kinds of corn and soybeans and whatever into them, which is great. That's a good option. It's one that's very common, corn and soybeans and some alfalfa or whatever. But it's important to identify how much is this costing me per pound of gain, which is the math that she mentioned earlier. And how much am I actually going to gain from getting that last 20 pounds out of these animals, right? So these are important to consider. You can maybe do something that's a little bit cheaper for a little bit longer. Maybe you dump in that really good high quality feed and only feed them for 3 more weeks. Whatever it's going to be, you just want to make sure that whatever outcome you're actually getting out of the animals, whatever market price per pound that you're going to get, makes sense when it comes to the feed, the cost of feed. That being said, if we're really close to the break-even point and it's going to be a make or break of, especially if you're in the niche marketing world, for example, if it's a make or break of that person coming back to you every year, these are all pieces that you have to build in to decide if it's going to work for you or not. And one of the cool things about the ration balancing softwares is most of them do include some kind of a cost per pound of gain analysis. So if you input how much that feed is costing you and you balance the ration and you say, I want 3 pounds of this and 2 pounds of that, it'll tell you how much it's costing per head per day, that kind of thing. So it's really handy to include that in your balancing system. A couple of quick things to wrap this up. When you put animals, especially ruminant animals, on high concentrate rations, you are putting yourself at risk of a handful of things that you just at least need to be aware of. Acidosis is an upset tummy essentially caused by the acid in those grains. And especially if you introduce these feeds to these animals too quickly, or maybe there's a big, climatic change that happens or a big storm that moves through, sometimes these animals can get that digestive upset, even if they're used to the feed that they're on. So it's really important to look out for animals that are acting sick, not going on feed. If they're not preferring to eat that day, there's something wrong, and that is something you can guarantee. This can be overcome by making sure you have some roughage in the diet and introducing those concentrates over time. You don't want to just start feeding a lamb 2.5 pounds of grain every day, right then and there. It's going to make them sick without question. So usually you want to step it up over a few weeks, give them 1/2 pound for a few days and then bump it up to 3/4 pound, whatever it may be, but do it over a 2 or 3 week cycle because that'll decrease your risk there. Enterotoxemia is one that can happen, which is a bacterial overgrowth that can be stimulated by the starch in those concentrate diets. So hit them with a vaccination for that. It's going to be worth it, especially if you're really bumping that concentrate diet all the way as high as you can go to get the most growth you can. Urinary calculi, this is one that happens when your calcium is not balanced well with the phosphorus. So you want to make sure that they have free choice to salt and mineral. You want to have, if you're at risk of this, having some kind of a ammonium chloride or something available to them that they can eat. This is typically going to be in the male lambs, which just causes that buildup of stones in their urethra and water belly, which can kill them. So another reason to have balanced your ration and really have a good understanding that your calcium to phosphorus ratio is spot on. Finally, when we're talking about confined feeding, a good rule of thumb is to provide enough space for your animals. So the bigger the animal, obviously, the more area that you should provide to them in that pen, but you want to have 2 to 5 meters squared per animal or 2 to 50. And this again depends on the size. If the animals are closer to full grown, or fully finished go on the higher side. Feeder spacing, if you have a single-sided feeder, give them about 16 inches or more so that they are insured to have access to that feed if you're feeding, if you're actively feeding those animals versus self feeders. If it's double-sided, they have access from both sides. You can give them 8 inches of space per animal. And then the self feeders, obviously, they're not going to be all eating all at the same time, all the time. So you can give them a little less space. I would err on the side of 10 inches per animal availability in that feeder, so that you're just making sure that those animals that are a little bit less aggressive are still getting what they need to be able to eat. If you're outdoors, especially making sure you have some shelter and windbreaks. Again, the weather can cause some digestive upset, can cause some changes in growth and performance. And you want to have well draining soils out in those confinement areas, as well as some kind of slope that allows the moisture to run off and keep things dry out there. And make sure that you always provide clean, unlimited water for these animals. And hopefully it's not driving you all crazy that I didn't give you a catch-all ration to finish your animals, but I hope that you see the importance of balancing and making sure that you're getting what you need out of your ration. So thank you. And here's my email address as well, if you would like to send me anything, whether it's help with balancing or other questions. Happy to take them, and happy to take questions from you now, along with Jaylin.
All right, so there's quite a few questions in the chat. How about we start backwards, since you just kind of finished up, and we'll get to you, Jaylin, last. Is that okay?
Sure.
All right. So question number 1, would you feel comfortable feeding high concentrate diets to lambs without ammonia chloride if you have balanced your calcium phosphorus, or do you prefer it?
I would say there's one of two things that you could do with that question. So first of all, if it's balanced properly, I don't really see an issue arising with the urinary calculi. However, you could provide an opportunity for that just in case. So it kind of depends on what your level of risk aversion is. But I personally don't provide it because I always make sure that my calcium to phosphorus is within range. So usually 2 to 7 calcium to 1 phosphorus is within range.
Awesome. Thank you. You recommend cracked corn over whole corn. Why? Digestibility and cost discussion.
Certainly, anytime corn is broke down in some way, it's going to be more digestively available. I don't think it's so much so, though, that if you are seeing a significant difference in price, that it's worth going that direction. So I think within the same price range, I would go with cracked or flaked or something. If it's a lot cheaper, I'd go with whole corn, and it's not going to affect you that much.
Back off on one follow-up question. Do you have to worry more about your acidosis concern with cracked corn as opposed to a whole corn? Just because those starches are more readily available?
Well, yes and no. I think it's pretty dependent on the status of the rumen bugs in your animals, because the starches are more readily available, but it's also going to take more processing to break down the whole corn. And so it kind of depends on the fermentation process that's taking place and how adept your animals are. I think when they're adapted to the feed properly, it doesn't matter that much. So, but it's a great point to the more readily available anything is, the quicker digestive upset can occur if they're not used to eating what you're giving them. And, we say step up the grain over a period of time. That holds true for any change in diet. So if you're on a high concentrate diet and you suddenly want to switch them to alfalfa, it's going to be the same principle, because the microbes that are utilizing concentrate feed versus forage-based feed are different. And so if they're not used to working very hard and there's not a big population of those types of microbes, it's going to cause some issues regardless of which direction you go. But concentrates are more of a problem because that acid that's being built up can cause a lot quicker issues, if you will, making those animals septic and causing death a lot more quickly, just due to the nature of that type of feed. But hopefully that answered your question.
We'll go with this one next. So what are ionophores?
Yeah, so ionophores are used in place of antibiotics. They are not restricted yet, but they are a coccidiostat, meaning that they assist the rumen in being able to fend off infection that can be caused by Coccidia bacteria, which are in the rumen. Coccidia are natural, but an overgrowth of coccidia can cause coccidiosis, which is a digestive upset that usually causes diarrhea. And so that's what the ionophores are intended for, is to just minimize that issue. However, they also come with increased intake, increased gains, all of those things. And as it stands right now, those are things that you can get and provide to your animals without having that veterinary patient relationship. But it is something that I think is on the verge. So certainly, even though you don't have to, I would still recommend working with your veterinarian on dosing and where to get it and what type to get. Those things are all important to work with your vet on. And I know that the next question is, what if we don't have a vet that works on small ruminants? I understand. I understand that's a challenge, but wherever possible, include your vet in these kinds of decisions, because that just increases your ability to have them work on your small ruminants, for example.
So this question kind of leads into this last one. What do you recommend for coccidia? And then they just mentioned they've had a high coccidia problem in the past.
Yeah, if you're having that problem, I would definitely recommend ionophores. And like I said, especially if you're having an active problem with it, that's when pulling a veterinarian in to make sure you're giving them the right amount and what they need. That's important.
Yeah. I'm not quite sure what this one is asking. Are there national grades for feed assessments or places that you can see seasonal averages? So
are we talking about feed?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, there is. It's the NAS.
Yeah.
Let me just do a quick Google.
Sorry. I think
USDA. Sorry, it is USDA NASS, and that'll give you statistics on feed costs, market prices, all of those things that are coming in on an annual basis. Let me put that into the chat here for everybody. So depending on, you can adjust it by where you are and what type of feed and all of those things. But that is, for the US at least, an option to find those. So USDA NASS, which is the National Agricultural Statistics Service.
Okay. So there's a question on, well, or not really a question, but any thoughts on feeding raw versus roasted soybeans?
Roasted is going to be more digestible, easier to break down. I don't have figures on how much so though, so I'm not sure I can speak to that specifically, but I will say that that's one of those scenarios where if it's something that's available to you and within cost effectiveness, it's probably worth doing. So I guess it kind of just, I don't know for sure where that would be a benefit, labor versus cost kind of a thing, but I think it would make it more readily available to the animals.
Also add in there for ruminants, you have to be careful because your raw soybeans do sometimes contain trypsin inhibitors. And if you have too high of concentration of trypsin inhibitors, you're gonna set back the animal's ability to actually digest protein. And so you have to be extremely careful with feeding raw soybeans because you can actually push those animals backwards as opposed to actually feeding them a high protein. So I guess I would err on the side of caution and go roasted.
Thank you.
I only say that because I saw it in heifer calves last fall. And now our heifers this year, or not our heifers, but the heifers have not a super great breed of. So
well, and I think that's difficult too for people who live in an area. I mean, I certainly don't have access readily to soybeans where I'm at in Idaho. So I think it's good to have those types of questions about the feeds that you have available to you, because, you know, for me, if I'm feeding soybean, it's soybean meal because that's what's available in my feed store, but that doesn't always give you the full picture either. So good to reach out.
So I guess talking about regional feedstuffs, there's a question on, do you have a nutritionist you recommend for making silage TMR mixes? And I guess that's very regional specific. I can chip in a little bit. I mean, here in Eastern South Dakota, I mean, one of our good sheep nutritionist works for Hubbard Feeds, and he's always my kind of go-to, like when I have a nutritionist or like a nutrition question that I don't know how to answer, like usually I call him, but that's going to be very regional specific. And I guess without knowing where you are, I would recommend kind of reaching out to your local extension office, and they might be able to help point you towards a nutritionist that would be really good for your area.
Yeah, I would say most of the feed mills are going to have a nutritionist that could help you. There's several sheep nutritionists throughout the country. I'm happy to help if that's something that I can do for you. Same thing goes though, and every one of them will ask you if you have a feed analysis that you've done on your silage. So that's going to be one of the main things to take care of to get a good, accurate view of that. One of the people who also provides some outreach that way is he works for Premier One.
Dan?
What's that?
Dan?
Yeah. So there's a lot of options, and all of these people are available to help. Some of them are not going to be free, and some of them are. So kind of depends on what you want to pay for and what you want to get.
So we have two questions on kind of like, so average daily gain. So one's asking kind of industry average for average daily gain in sheep and goats. And then another one's kind of asking about average daily gain on quality pastures with no rations. So like a grass finished.
Grass finished growth is going to vary based on what types of grass are in the pasture and what maturity level the grasses are. Like I said, anything that's less mature is going to have greater nutrient values, but even within the grasses, it's still going to vary. And it's also going to vary by the type and breed of animal. So, I mean, on really good quality pasture, I could see a 0.4 to 0.5 type of growth on a lamb, maybe a little lower on goats, especially because goats are more inclined to eat things like shrubs and forbs and that type of thing. And so the pasture setting for growing goats versus sheep is a little bit different. Jalen, do you have anything to add to that? I'm not sure I'm 100% in the ballpark, but I would say that you're not going to get 2/3 of a pound of gain every day on pasture. So regardless of what type of animal you have.
Agree. I think, we're not feeding nearly as high of a concentration of protein and energy as you are in a grain type system. And so you're probably right. The figures that Melinda gave, like I think on the bottom, I thought the lambs was 0.4 and the bottom, I thought the goats was 0.5. That's probably where you're going to be targeting more on your grass-fed animals. We also have to keep in mind that if you're out on a pasture, they're going to be expending more energy walking to find grazing or walking back to water. So yeah, I definitely assume a much lower rate of gain. It probably is partially dependent on what's out in your pastures too. If your pastures are predominantly grass, they're not going to have nearly as high of a concentration of protein and energy as like your forage or your browse species will. And I might have repeated something you said. I was trying to multitask. There was another question about average daily gain and carcass quality. And I would say that just because something has a really high average daily gain, you can overfeed that animal more quickly. And so typically your higher, faster gaining animals are your meat type breeds. So you might have larger ribeyes, larger legs, things like that on those higher gaining animals. But that's not to say that your low gaining animals are going to produce a low quality carcass. I think it's just a matter of managing those animals according to their growth pattern.
So Jalen, maybe you can touch upon this a little bit. Somebody's asking like the quality of 100% grass fed versus grain finish. What kind of research is out there on that?
Yeah, so I think we have to get a little bit careful because there's some claims out there that we have to watch. But from a quality standpoint, again, really just looking at our different fat deposition and things like that, our grass-fed animals are going to be significantly leaner. If you have heard the claim that grass-fed is higher in some of your like omega-3 amino acids and like your conjugated linoleic acid, which is a anti-carcinogen, that is true. Your grass-fed animals tend to be higher in some of those types of fatty acids. However, I wouldn't say that it's to a necessarily significant amount. We can say that our grass-fed animals are higher in omega-3s, but when you compare that to something like a fish, our ruminant species really don't contribute that much to our dietary omega-3s. So I think from a quality standpoint, yes, they're going to be leaner, but I mean, you get roughly the same nutritional value out of a grass-fed animal that you do a grain-fed animal.
This could be a question for either of you. How fat is too fat on our young does?
I think it depends on, by young does, do you mean are we going to slaughter them, or do you mean are we going to keep them as replacement animals? And so when we're talking about body condition scoring for a replacement animal, you want your replacement does or ewes, in my mind, especially going into breeding, to be around 3.5 to 4 body condition. You want them to be a little get a little bit of meat and fat on them, but you don't want them to be so obese that they won't breed up, which is one of the challenges that can happen. Obese animals also sometimes have challenges with their udder when it comes to their first lactation. They don't have enough space amongst all the fat cells to make the proper amount of milk. And so I certainly think you want to have enough condition on them that they're healthy, they're able to grow well, but you don't want them to be obese. as far as finishing goes, that's more Jalen's neck of the woods.
Well, I guess we could touch back on, like, when I talked about body condition. Typically we want our ewes and does in like a, somewhere between a 2 and a 3. Depending on the stage of production.
And we do have a question in here, since we're talking about finishing a little bit. Any insight on customer preference for hair sheep finishing weights versus wool sheep finishing weights?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a good question. I think it goes back partially to, that equation that I provided with the ideal finish weight being 65% of your flock's mature weight. Was based primarily around wool type sheep, but the same basis could be provided for hair sheep. Again, your hair sheep are typically going to be a much smaller frame, going to finish at significantly lower weights. A lot of those hair sheep are going into an ethnic market where they want something even leaner than necessarily our commercial market. And so finishing those hair lambs significantly lighter probably than most of our larger framed wool type sheep. From a consumer preference standpoint, the research hasn't really shown a difference in consumer preference. There's not a lot of research out there doing breed comparisons. But I think at the end of the day, regardless of what type of sheep you're producing, we just want to contribute to increasing our lamb consumption.
Thanks. So there is another question about recommend processing Dorset like cross lambs, or what live weight do you recommend processing Dorset cross lambs? So maybe if you still have your presentation, you can pull it up and just kind of briefly go over that like table again. So how people can kind of calculate that based off of their breed of sheep. Sorry.
No, that's okay. Yeah, so for a Dorset, like on here, usually mature ewe weights on those Dorsets, you're looking at 180 pounds. I don't know what you're crossing your Dorsets with, or if you're using them as your terminal sire. But even if you're crossing different breeds, you can still use this table or use this equation as your basis. So your average ram weight, average ewe weight, the average of those two times that 65%. But I'll leave this table up for a second if people want to look and find the number that works for their flock.
So just for clarity for anybody, so on your left-hand side, that's your ewe breed mature weight. Up the top is the sire breed mature weight. And so then if you're using that table, you're just finding the two weights, finding the middle.
Yeah.
So. This is another question for you, Jalen. How are we supposed to make a profit at $5 or $6 a pound for a carcass? And then just made a comment about how hay is expensive.
Yep. And I think that's where we really have to, Melinda mentioned it and so did I, is knowing your break even. And if $5 to $6 a pound isn't going to work for you, I understand that. And I'll pull up while I have this screen open. I think there was one in there about explaining this table a little, or this document a little bit better as well. So as you can see, we'll use lambs, which are on the left side. But basically what you're looking at is basing your prices off of that direct to consumer retail value. And so they obviously don't provide every single cut that you could possibly get your lambs processed into or your goats. But down the center there, you have, or I guess on the left, you have your cuts, and then you have the range of dollars per pound that people are receiving for that product. So just there at the top, loin chops, direct to consumer producers are getting anywhere from $14.98 a pound to $46.66 a pound. So you can see that there's a huge range. But the average of people that are reporting their prices, direct marketing, are getting about $24 a pound for those loin chops. And so you can see the same thing for the other cuts, and then up here for the goat side of things as well. If you're selling halves and wholes, that's where you can come down to the direct to consumer carcass. And again, on average, if somebody's buying a whole carcass, you're looking at almost $10 a pound or a half at $11 a pound. So that's where you really have to play with what price can you sell those cuts at, adjust them accordingly. You know, your rack and your loin are going to be your more valuable cuts, and people probably aren't going to pay the same price for a cut that comes from the shoulder that they are from the loin or the rack or something like that. But what value do you have to sell those cuts at to cover your processing, your marketing, your feed, and the value of that animal? So hopefully that helped explain that a little bit.
We have a couple questions on, so there's one specifically, like, do you guys have any ideas on the nutritional profile of browse in East Texas farms? So thinking of browse other than pasture. And there's also another one just asking about like pasture quality, like what makes it a really good or high quality. Is there some resources that they can maybe look up to kind of see, or, you know, do pasture sampling, or what would you guys kind of recommend on kind of figuring out those nutritional profiles?
Shrubs are interesting characters because they their nutritional value is super variable across the seasons. So when we're putting on like new growth, they're higher nutritional value, but they also sometimes have, you know, more toxins associated with them. I think when it comes to those types of questions, it's important to identify what shrubs are there, and then we can talk about them in a more specific way. You know, like, and also when it comes down to whether or not the animals are willing to consume those types of browse, you know, you think about like sheep consuming sagebrush, they more readily consume it in the fall. And it has some to do with the bitter profile that's in the plant based on the time of year and the growth that it's having. So it's really hard to do a catch-all on browse, and I'm not super familiar with Texas browse. So I would certainly entertain an email with some more specifics that I could maybe help with on that regard. Another option too is to take some clippings and send it in for nutritional analysis. Those things can be done on any type of forage. So, but you still want to kind of know what it is so they can adjust their curves to what you've sent in. But yeah, there's a couple ways to go about that. Shrubs, especially for goats, are great nutritional any time of year for goats, really. Sheep are a little more specific about when they're willing to consume them, but a lot of times they are still pretty good options, especially maybe for fall feed or winter feed, that kind of thing. I didn't answer your question, but hopefully I gave you some direction of where to go.
Okay, so there was a follow-up question on that feed assessments. So they meant a grading system on hay quality, so it's easier to understand whether you're buying is like the top or basically cardboard. Do you?
Yeah, I can give you a general idea of quality versus not so high quality grass hay. So if you're looking at grass hay that's anything under maybe 8% protein, crude protein, and honestly, a good grass hay should be 60+% TDN. So anything that falls into both of those categories is going to be pretty poor quality hay. Moderate quality hay, I would say, falls in the 8 to 10 or 11% protein and 60 to 65% TDN. Anything above 65% TDN on grass hay and anything above maybe 11% protein on grass hay is going to be pretty good quality. I've seen grass hay as high as 14 to 16% protein, but it's not super common. There's pretty specific grasses that have to be in there for that to happen. When we're talking about alfalfa, we want our protein to be 15–16% protein at minimum, and probably 50 to 55% TDN at minimum, to give you a good quality alfalfa hay. And then of course, if you're having a hay alfalfa or grass alfalfa mix, it should fall somewhere in the middle there. So that just gives you an idea. Not to say that poor quality hay can't still be valuable. A lot of times what you'll see is low protein and better TDN. So you can build that in to your feed ration as the energy component and then bring in a protein supplement like alfalfa.
So we have a lot of kind of nutrition ones. This one's a pretty easy one. What's your favorite ration balancing software?
I personally use Sheep Bites. Like I mentioned, it does come with a cost, but I really like that software is nice. You can talk about your animals both from a production system standpoint as well as the time of year that calculates in temperature and wind and all of those things. And additionally, it really goes into a lot of the mineral ratios that you need to keep in mind and those types of things, and it helps you really understand all of the pieces. It's somewhat complex to use if you don't understand all of the things. And like I said, it costs some money to use, but there's a lot of programs that are free out there. When I use the free one, I personally use the Montana State University one, but that doesn't mean that the rest are not equally as good of options. So it kind of just depends on how, I guess, up to speed you are on the way that nutrition really works. And then they're all going to take a bit of a learning curve. Doesn't matter which one you pick, but that's why you have people like myself and others that are willing to help with those types of things. And it's a matter of just kind of going through a tutorial. And honestly, if I have enough interest in that, we can walk through some of these programs in more detail one day on a webinar or whatever. I think if that's helpful, maybe make a comment or whatever, but we could certainly do that at that depth if that would be of interest to folks.
So there's a person asking about finishing lambs with grass hay and chickpeas, and there's not a lot of information on feeding chickpeas. Have you had any experience with it? I know I certainly have not had any experience feeding chickpeas.
Chickpeas are gonna be a good option for protein and energy. I can't give you a really detailed understanding of how much you could feed because I would need to see the nutrient content because I don't specifically know off the top of my head. But I actually think it would probably be a pretty good complement to grass hay. We just have to balance that out and make sure that it works. But I would say yes, go for it. If it's available and cost effective. Yeah, probably a good option.
You recommend Rumensin or Bovatec more?
I don't know that I have a preference. I think they're both good options.
I'm just trying to remember. Rumensin isn't the one technically approved for sheep, right? So you have to have that extra label
right
oversight. Yep. So and there is that factor. I mean, most lamb feed and stuff comes with, if it's a made feed, comes with Bovatec in it. So
Right. Yeah. Again, I think working with your veterinarian is a good call when it comes to ionophores, even though you don't have to, but I still would. And
yeah.
I still do. When I work with stuff like that, I work with my vet. So
Is it possible to give ammonia chloride through drinking water?
I suppose it probably is, but I'm not sure I would recommend it because those are the types of things you want to make available, but not force on the animals. So I would probably try to stick to just a form that they can access if and when they want to. They'll know if they need it.
So do you give it free like choice for them to like come to, or do you normally just mix it in?
I would say a free choice option, maybe alongside your mineral supplementation or whatever. I don't like to mix it with things just because it can change how much they consume of the other part that's in there. Because like I said, they're only going to consume it if they feel like they need it. That's one of those ones that the body does tell them to go for.
Any thoughts on wet feeding grain?
On wet feeding,
Yeah.
it sounds like a lot of extra work to me, but I don't see anything wrong with it necessarily, especially if you have, I guess depending on what type of feed that you're putting in there, sometimes adding the moisture to it will decrease some of the risk of not consuming enough water. It'll decrease choking hazard risk, which can occasionally happen with pellets and stuff like that. Wet feeding can also give you the opportunity to mix in a mineral package and allow it to be more consistent. So it kind of depends on the reason why and whether or not it's worth the time and effort to do it, I guess.
Yeah.
But it should not be the only source of water.
Yeah. Do you have any advice for raising dairy breeds for milk production and harvesting their offspring for meat?
I think my advice would be if you're going to do that specifically, then have a terminal sire that is a meat breed, because that'll allow you to capture more of a growth potential than just a dairy breed would. And they're going to make the same milk no matter what kind of baby they have. So
What I was gonna say too.
We're getting to the end here. So there's a question, too bad Chad wasn't here, and there a question on mineral bars. With the individual minerals, not a mix. What do you think of this thought?
well, it's better than nothing. Well, there's a lot of people in the world who don't provide mineral supplementation to their small ruminants, which I think is a bad idea. I don't know for sure how the animals utilize those, as far as do they pick and choose based on what they need or that kind of thing. I don't know the answer to that. My go-to answer is always, if you're willing to do feed analysis and balancing of rations, then it also is of benefit to have a mineral mix made up that is fitting to your operation. And I do recognize that sometimes when you have a small operation, it's not cost effective to do that. But I also think a lot of times we're missing the mark on our minerals just because they are so variable, even within a geographic location. And you can't buy a mineral that's developed in Louisiana and have it mixed and do proper work on your animals in Idaho. So I think whenever possible, having a good understanding of what you need in a mineral mix, as well as where that is being developed for, because it can be very different across the country. So that's my soapbox answer. But kudos to anyone who's using a small ruminant mineral of any kind, just because it is so important. And even if it's a little off the mark, it's still better than nothing. So.
So there's just one that I kind of saved towards the end, about providing any information on Barbados black belly sheep. I guess I haven't worked with them much. I don't know if you guys have ever worked with them at all. But I guess I can say, like, when you're talking about like lamb finishing and stuff, like using the table that Jalen provided, is a good resource to kind of find those finishing weights, or calculate an estimated finishing weight. And I mean, I guess Melinda can probably chip on the nutrition side. I mean, it doesn't matter, what breed of sheep you're feeding, the nutritional requirements are all kind of a standard between breeds. It's just, looking up, the weight of your animal and kind of using that to calculate your requirements. So I don't know if you guys have anything else to add with that, but
No, I think you hit it. Nutrition is going to be the same regardless of breed, although mixing in the different frame sizes of animals and all of those things, when you're thinking about mature size and all of that. But I think that anybody who's new to raising sheep or goats, we have a great resource in our University of Idaho Extension Livestock YouTube channel. All of the webinars that we've ever done are on there for you to view at any time. And that person also mentioned the Maryland Small Ruminant page. That is a great resource. And there's a couple of other resources that are really great. One of my favorites is Story's Guide to Sheep Production. That's one of my favorite books to recommend to people because it's written very well in layman terms, but it covers a lot of the critical aspects of raising sheep. And I think there's also a goat one, although I don't know for sure. But that's a great resource. So, and then anything very specific, we're all here if you want to reach out to us. And we will make sure that the right person gets the question and gets it answered. So reach out.
I guess there's a follow-up question on the ammonia chloride. Can the ammonia chloride be as a lick or just on its own? So
I think either way, like I said, I think it's important to just have it separate of all the other things, but whatever source that you can provide it to them that makes sense for you is fine, whether it's a loose one that you put in a bucket or a lick or whatever works. I think it's important not to limit mineral consumption because it's in there, and again, something that probably didn't get mentioned is you always want to have just a pure white salt block or loose salt, whatever, because salt's one of those ones that they may consume more or less of based on what they need. And you don't want to limit mineral consumption just because they're trying to get salt somewhere. So those are all things to kind of just offer separately, let them have the opportunity to decide if they need it or not. And I have to be honest, I don't actually know all the different forms that you can put ammonium chloride out for them. Because like I said, if you spend the time and the money to balance your rations, you should be in a little better shape as far as not needing it. But
okay. Well, I don't really see any other questions, and I know we're coming up on 3 o'clock my time, 2 o'clock your guys' time. So I guess thank you everybody who's still on for attending. We're always glad to have you. And I guess if there's any questions that you need more answers to or need something more specifically, feel free to email any of us. We're happy to help any way that we can. So thank you for joining this month's webinar.
Thank you. We'll see you guys next month.